When I was speaking to a friend of mine who was a teacher in a secondary school in a borough that has a high proportion of Muslim children, and the teachers would always say in the staff room, I really love teaching in this borough. And he would say, oh, is it because of the diversity, different languages, different culture, different foods? And they said, no, because parents don't bother you here. When I was in the other borough in Kensington and Chelsea, parents would come to me every other day with queries, and that is a healthy relationship. If parents are proactively and constructively engaged with the schools continuously, that means that the quality of education generally will be much higher in those schools. The complacency that sometimes you see in some schools will not exist, and parents would have a much better relationship with the school and vice versa. So I think really what we've got to do is, through this process, we need to change the dynamic between schools and parents. Parents are not people who the schools are doing a favor. We are stakeholders in the school, and we have the absolute right to approach schools with our feedback, both positive and negative. And schools need to respond to those feedback. That feedback.
There's a lot of inaccurate information going around, being shared by parents. Here's what's really happening with sex education in schools this year.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's Unscripted podcast, lockdown edition. Now, it's September 2020 already, and guess what? Many of us have floating around in our minds that September 2020, something's going to happen. Something about RSE, SRE, LGBT, LMNOP, all of these different abbreviations are floating around our minds. Some of it is true, some of it is maybe a bit of controversy, a bit of sensationalism. So who better to guide us through this than our old pal, Yusuf Patel. Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Normally we do these fake salams, but it feels even more infuriating after we just spent half an hour testing your mic. But
I know.
If anyone from Rhodes watching, then consider this a bad review for you. So, first question is, what the heck is going on?
Well, obviously, all parents are expecting that relationship education in primary schools and relationship sex education in secondary schools will be taught in all English schools from September 2020, from this month. And obviously, there's lots of disquiet, lots of angst and nervousness amongst parents as to what to expect and what to do. And I've been receiving lots and lots of invitations to speak about this subject, and lots of frantic calls from parents asking, what do I do, and what can I do to try and either stop this or try and change the way schools teach this subject. And so I think it's although we've been speaking about this for a couple of years, there's still the actual the word or the final word on how to respond to these changes has not really penetrated the masses. So inshallah, hopefully this opportunity will provide that platform to do so.
So you always remind me of so you are to SRE and sex education what people like Dr. Imran Qureshi and Qasim Rafiq are to the coronavirus. So
those names don't mean anything to me.
So I mean, they were like rock stars basically. So Imran Qureshi was, a consultant in infection disease. Qasim Rafiq is part of the team creating the vaccine for the coronavirus, right? So everyone was like, going to them, getting advice and guidance from them. So likewise yourself, you've been kind of called all over the country, doing a lot of tourism over the last few years, because even though you've been talking about SRE and sex education for like the better part of a decade with SRE Islamic, a little plug there, that was, before it became a big thing in most household kind of dinner tables and chat rooms and so forth. So recently, everyone's been basically, calling Yusuf up and having them give presentation and stuff to their local mosques or Islamic schools or whatever. But what I want you to do is just basically get across the main things that people, parents like ourselves, need to know. Our rights, what the reality is about RSE and SRE, and what all these terms mean, by the way, in the first place, and what's actually going on in our children's schools, and how we can kind of constructively be part of that conversation. So let's start off with some acronyms or abbreviations. What is RSE? What is SRE?
So SRE it stands for sex and relationship education, and that's the name for the subject that's been taught in schools for many decades. I remember this back in the 18th century when I went to school. They were teaching this subject as well.
Yeah.
So it's not something something new. So anybody who's been through a schooling system would have heard of this term, or a slight difference or a variation in this term. But really, what it was is that it was a subject that was non-statutory, meaning that schools did not have to teach it, but Ofsted would roll their eyes if they inspected your school and found that you were not teaching it.
Yeah.
So the pressure came from Ofsted. So and it covered a whole host of different issues. It covered marriage. It covered same-sex relationships. It covered different types of relationships. It covered boyfriend-girlfriend relationships. It covered puberty. It covered some schools covered online content, but because there was no centrally created curriculum, each school tended to use off-the-shelf resources, the popular resources in their schools, which meant that most schools that use the same resources across the country tended to look the same in terms of the way they approach the subject. So there was not really any cultural sensitivities about the pupils at any particular school. There was no sense of is this appropriate for this age group? It was really a tick box exercise that schools went through, that we're teaching it, and so that went on for a number of years, and obviously we've got to recognize that on the peripheries of this discussion, there's these lobby groups out there who are calling for the government to make this subject statutory. So lots of different groups, with lots of money, and with campaigns to the government to say, look, we're not meeting the needs of young people. They did surveys amongst young people. Young people want to hear more and more about sex education. Parents aren't doing enough. And in the end, that message penetrated the heart of government, and there was a real push from both sides to actually come up with a solution to ensure that this subject or these subjects are taught in schools.
Okay. Before we proceed, I just want to remind listeners that due to my own personal maturity levels, you might want to consider that there's a bit of a 15 or 18 age rating to this podcast. So if you are listening with some kids around, maybe reach for the headphones. I don't know what I'm going to blurt out, and Yusuf's come pretty close with some risque puns himself. But just as a reminder as well, if you're watching this for the first time, click the subscribe button and the bell notification if you're watching it on YouTube to be at the front of the queue whenever we release any more videos like this. And we're available wherever you get your podcasts. So Yusuf, you're saying SRE was sex and relationship education. It's been around since the 18th century, since when you were back in school. And that now, is it accurate to say that's become statutory, or is it something else? What's this RSE we've been hearing about?
So I think it's very important. Whenever we hear this a lot, people say, look, they're going to teach sex education in schools from the age of 5. That's what the headline stated. Headlines in a lot of newspapers. And that's what still, some of the messages still get on WhatsApp groups. And whenever I have any of these sessions for parents where we discuss the intricacies of the changes, one of the first questions is, they're going to teach my children from the age of 5, isn't it? And that's not really accurate, because in primary schools still, even from this month, from September 2020, there isn't sex education will not be statutory in primary schools. The subject there's no such thing as statutory sex education in primary schools, but there will be a new subject called relationships education. That doesn't mean that there are no problems with this new subject, but just from the outset, that it was never envisioned or envisaged that this subject would be or would contain discussions around sex education.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a bit of maybe a sensationalist headline here and there to say, kids will be taught the details of sex education and so forth when they're in primary school.
Yeah, obviously that doesn't mean obviously all schools, even though the statute.
Wait, so the discretion of the school.
Yeah, so all schools can still teach sex education, but that if they do so, parents have the full right of withdrawal, unlike with relationship education.
Okay.
Now, if you look at relationship education, and if you look at the basic requirements of this subject, there's 4 main topic areas, and these topic areas don't really go into any if they're tackled at the basic level of what the curriculum outcomes expect, there shouldn't be a problem. But the issue is, because these issues become a big ideological battleground, lots of schools with some ideological agendas may try and include aspects of concepts which are not directly included within the learning outcomes for relationships education. And that's one of the real concerns that parents have, and it is a legitimate concern.
So we've got like echoes of those Birmingham protests in our minds. So that was like 1 or 2 schools that had caused a bit of a stir amidst the vast majority of schools in Birmingham, not having that much of a problem. But those 1 or 2 schools, there was an uproar amongst the parents that the kids are being taught all this LGBT stuff, some ideological and moralistic kind of teaching about what is right and wrong, rather than just simply what is. So that stuff is not part of the curriculum, you're saying. That is just some schools might be a bit, or some teachers might be a bit overzealous to spread their opinions or beliefs about certain things.
I think I think a lot of the disquiet about the way these subjects are going to be taught comes down to the lack of clarity from government.
Yeah.
So when the government initially published the guidance, there was a certain set of rules which governed how these subjects are going to be taught. Chief amongst them was around LGBT.
Yeah.
I remember last year the government produced what they called a Mythbusters document, which sought to allay fears of parents around what will be taught and what won't be taught. So some of those elements, so they, for example, had a quote in there which said that if a primary school does not consider it age appropriate to cover LGBT content, there's no requirement to do so. So that's in a primary school setting, and so that reassured parents that actually there is a way in which which schools do not have to teach the subject.
Oops, I've lost your audio for a second.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep. See.
So with that, when the government said that there is no, that if a primary school doesn't consider it to be age appropriate to cover LGBT content, then there's no requirement to do so. Parents felt that this is good. At least we've got some backing, some authoritative statement to point to, so that schools don't teach this to my children, because we don't think teaching about same-sex relationships or about even boyfriend-girlfriend relationships or anything related to relationships which are at the face of it or come down to sexual relationships between people and their sexual choices, that should be discussed with children at such a young age. But then the government then, just before the election, redrafted that document because they felt nobody's really looking, and they took out that statement and they made a statement which made it seem as though they were now recommending schools much more than they were previously to teach LGBT content. So then that made parents feel, so what is the government line now?
Yeah.
I remember being at an event with some Department of Education officials who were part of the RSC team, and there were people from all over the Muslim community across London at this event. And I asked a question. I said, look, why isn't this definitive statement that's in the Mythbusters document in the guidance, which is in its final form? And they said, no, we made assurances. It's very clear. Our position is very clear. And then 6 months later, this was changed. And this is really it shows how the government is confused, and as we know with the coronavirus and the government positions around that, the government is probably not in the best position to give.
Well, either confused, or someone could say that they're trying to walk a tightrope and trying to please everyone. So they're going to be some kind of LGBT ideology kind of campaigners trying to get their thing in, and other people trying to get their thing in. Yeah. So maybe they're trying to make this confused mishmash. Could be just trying to please or not, not infuriate everyone or anyone too much, maybe. So what's the current state of play then?
That balance is very one-sided then at the moment.
Yeah.
So the current situation is that the guidance, for example, the schools minister Nick Gibb mentioned in a statement in Parliament where he said that really schools are in the best position to decide on when to teach what when, and even that, so that gave a certain assurance to parents. When you speak to schools say no, the government is highly recommending. When you speak to DFE, they're highly recommending that we teach about LGBT relationships. But what we're arguing is that, okay, if we're not going to go back and forth on an issue which the government is seemingly clear upon, or the guidance seemingly is saying that this has to be taught in primary schools. But what we should say is that almost reframe the discussion and say, okay, if you want to reflect the background of the pupils at your school when you talk about relationships, and you say John has 2 mothers or Jeffrey has 2 fathers, then okay, so you that as a factual position. But when you go into saying that, Abdul, you could be gay and there's nothing wrong with that, that's happened. That's happened in schools. Or you say to Zainab, you could be a boy. Your gender, whether you're a boy or a girl, is not something fixed. It's like your hair color. Yeah, you can change your hair color. You can change your gender. So that creates confusion amongst children about, okay, I'm a boy, or am I a girl? I'm a boy. Can I change my gender? And so this is where almost teachers become gender activists in the classroom, which is not really what parents expect, and it's not something that will create a cohesion or a strong relationship between parents and the school. So I think if we say to schools, actually, if you're going to teach it in a factual way, don't go beyond that factual position of saying that some people have, and don't go beyond, don't start to almost promote certain ideological positions to children, because that's not your role.
So what can parents do then? So you're saying sex education, that's not actually statutory for primary school children, but they still might have sex education lessons in primary school. It's up to the discretion of the school. So presumably the parents, if they feel that they don't want their kids in these lessons, they can pull them out of those. No problem there.
Yes, so they've got the absolute right to withdraw their children from these classes, absolutely.
From sex education classes.
Yeah.
Now there's another thing called, you're saying, relationships education, or relationships and health education, RHE.
Yeah.
You can't take your kids out of those, but what you can do is finish the sentence.
What you can do is one thing that schools have to do is they have to consult parents about 2 areas of the curriculum, because what the government said when they formulated the learning outcomes, they made them very broad, and they said we don't want to be very prescriptive about the way we define these subjects, because we want to give schools the flexibility to teach these subjects in collaboration or in consultation with parents, reflective of the background of the pupils at that school. So one thing they didn't do is when they said, for example, families who care about me is one of the topic areas, and it said pupils should know. One of the things is that families are important for children growing up because they can give love, security, and stability. So that's something that children should know. But it says children should know by the end of primary school. So what that means is that the schools have to translate these curriculum outcomes in these 4 main topic areas into the schools syllabus. So that means that they've got to say, in year 1, we're going to teach these outcomes. In year 2, we're going to teach these. In year 3, year 4, and year 5, and year 6, we're going to teach these learning outcomes. So the government didn't set down which year groups to cover all this content. So this is up for grabs. This is almost this should be a conversation between parents and the school about what is appropriate to be taught at which year group. And then secondly, the other area that schools have some flexibility about is the resources. So the resources have not been set in stone by the government. The government hasn't said you have to use these resources or these worksheets or these websites. Rather, that's left up to the discretion of the school in consultation with parents. And some of the things that are in the guidance documents which make it very clear that schools have to do is that schools have to reflect the age and religious background of the pupils at that school, which means that they can't just say, if a school has a particular proportion of Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, or people from different religious backgrounds, they have to make sure that they're reflecting the age and religious background of the pupils when they're deciding on the teaching and the materials and the resources that they use.
Yeah.
So this and there's also very supportive statements in the guidance about schools working with parents and involving them in the process of decision making. And so all of this has to be in place.
Do schools have to consult parents?
Yes, they do. But the problem is, and this exemplifies the government. Yeah, the government has said consultation has to happen, but they haven't really clarified what meaningful consultation looks like. They've just said you've got to consult parents, you've got to take their views into account. But what does that mean? Taking their views into account for one school may be interpreted as bringing the parents into the school hall and showing them the resources and saying, are you happy with these resources? And if the parents say not really, they say, okay, tough, we've already bought them. Is that meaningful consultation? Or is meaningful consultation, these are all the resources that we're going to use, what do you think? And parents say, actually, I don't mind these particular resources, but those resources are just inappropriate. They're too much too soon for my children. And if parents do say that, then a school should say, okay, we're not going to use these particular resources. Maybe worksheet 5, 6, and 7, we're not going to include. But if what the school decides at the beginning of the consultation process is exactly the same to what they have in place at the end of that consultation process, then that means that there wasn't really a meaningful consultation process. You just rubber stamp
box ticking exercise.
So I think really what we're saying is to schools is that to avoid another Birmingham, to avoid that conflict which we really don't want and need in schools, because that creates a breakdown relationship between schools and parents. If we want to avoid that, then we've got to ensure that the seeds of those conflicts don't arise. And the seeds of the conflicts in Birmingham arose when parents felt that their views were not taken into account. And so we're asking for parents and schools to work together.
I'm guessing that most schools probably are too busy on running the rest of the school to worry that much about the exact resources and so forth, and they're probably happy to just accept any resources or worksheets or whatever that any organization happens to take the time out to make for them, and can sell to them or give to them for free. But there will be some people who are quite passionate, quite ideologically kind of motivated to impose certain social constructs or moral kind of positions on students, right? Obviously, that school in Birmingham comes to mind. That No Outsiders, Andrew Moffat kind of, the desire to civilize the brown children, the desire to, and linking it up with prevent and extremism and imposing British values and so forth on these kind of backwards inferior cultures and stuff. So there will be some people like that who want to kind of proselytize and kind of civilize and enlighten these brown or foreign kind of backwards kids from backwards families and enlighten them and stuff. But I suppose you need a different set of approaches for when there is somebody like that in the school and when there isn't, right? Because if you take I'm assuming if you take a kind of an unnecessarily adversarial approach with the school, they might think, what's this all about, and this is a bit, overreacting and so forth. Likewise, if you take a softy approach with somebody who is, generally, espousing racist and Islamophobic kind of logics, then it's not a correct match. So I think the thing that parents have grown to know now is if your child is in a school, you have to, if you care about the child, you have to be involved in that school to some extent, and have to have that communication with the school leadership team to some extent or the other. Now, if you haven't so far for whatever reason, maybe you didn't know what to do, maybe you didn't know what your rights are, maybe you didn't know that this stuff is happening behind the school doors, what can parents do to exercise their rights to have a good, proactive relationship with their children's school? What is accurate, what is realistic for them to expect from that, and unrealistic to expect?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point, that in terms of generally when parents, if parents only approach schools when they've got a complaint or an issue with the school, it's a human thing. It's, we sometimes we don't see that, we don't see head teachers as human beings we don't see them as having almost if, for example, we've got a friend and that we only approach that friend when we've got problems, there'll come a point in time where that friend will say, "You're just using me. You just come to me with your problems. You don't. It's not. There's no give and take in this relationship." Yeah.
Or if we just want to invite you to a podcast and use you all the time.
I didn't want to bring that up, but yeah, I think this is about human interaction, about relationship building.
Yeah.
If you're a parent who volunteers when it comes to taking children out on trips, if you're a parent who gives positive feedback to a school when they've done something good, then when you come to a school and say, actually, I'm a bit concerned about this particular area, can we have a discussion? More often than not, the head teacher, this is a parent who's really involved in our school. Yeah, let me take the time to actually speak to them.
Yeah.
We don't say that's a prerequisite for a relationship, but if you want to influence a school, then you've got to be involved in the school at different levels. If you're a governor at the school, more than likely, if you're involved in the governing position at the school, when you approach the head teacher, they'll listen to you more. But so I think as a long-term strategy, we've got to be much more involved in schools, not just because we want to get into schools, but because our children are there. We are stakeholders of school. We should be proactive stakeholders in schools.
Yeah.
In terms of when you approach schools about this issue, one thing I would say is that parents will always say, "Have you got a template letter for me to send?" And actually, template letters are the worst things to send. Yeah, if you send a template letter as your first interaction with the school, sometimes it will be disregarded or you'll be pigeonholed.
Yeah.
If you just pick up the phone and say, "Look, I want to have a quick word. Either obviously, can I come in to see you, or if coronavirus doesn't allow for that to happen, can I just have a Zoom call with you, or can I have a time when I can call you and have a word over the phone?" I think that will be.
Is that with the head teacher or just any teacher?
The head teacher. Most teachers in the school don't have decision-making powers around the policy or around implementation of these subjects.
Yeah.
So it's best to speak to decision makers. Decision makers in the school are generally going to be the head teacher and the chair of governors. Out of all the governing body, they're the two who will really sit down together and most often than not draft things out and then take it to the general governing board for ratification. So we need to get involved, get to the levers of power in a school, and that's the head teacher and the governing, the chair of governors of the governing board.
So imagine if I'm a head teacher now, right? You're a parent of a child that goes to this school. What would you say to me?
I would say, okay, I've heard a lot about relationship education. That's statutory in all schools.
My name is Mr. Principal Singh.
Mr. Singh. My name
Sir
is
Singh, actually. My high, just as a tangent, my high school Drayton Manor High School, our principal was Pritpal Singh, Sir Pritpal Singh. Yeah, so he really
Mr.
turned the
Singh,
school around.
I'd say, Mr. Singh, my name is Yusuf. I'm the father of Ahmed, who attends your school. First, I'd like to say I'm really pleased by the quality of education at school. I know I don't say enough, and parents probably don't say enough to you, but we really are very appreciative of all the things you do for our children. So I just like to take the opportunity to say thank you. And secondly, obviously, I've heard a lot of whispers around relationship education that's going to be taught in all schools from this month. And I understand also that the Department for Education has allowed for schools to delay the implementation of this subject because of coronavirus up to the summer term of 2021. So I wondered whether you could have a brief conversation either now or a little later about your plans to consult parents, because I'd really like to get involved in that consultation process because I'd like to be involved in my children's education.
Okay, let's talk now. Are you a homophobe?
Okay.
Why do you want why don't you want little Ahmed to know about little Jimmy's two mums?
No, I think I'm really more interested in the process of getting parents involved in deciding how and when these subjects are going to be taught. So I'm really interested in what you've set out as the official processes by which you're going to consult parents around these subjects.
Okay, I don't know what he would say.
So what I think really what we need to see is that lots of schools are used to teaching these subjects in a particular way, and the way that they consult parents is generally a very tick box exercise. And I think sometimes we've got to be involved in trying to change the culture around those relationships, because if they've always done things in a particular way, usually they'll continue doing that. So unless there's some parental feedback, there's some communication from parents around what they expect, usually schools will do things in exactly the same way as they've always done. You know, when I was speaking to a friend of mine who was a teacher in a secondary school in a borough that has a high proportion of Muslim children, and the teachers would always say in the staff room, I really love teaching in this borough, and he would say, oh, is it because of the diversity, different languages, different culture, different foods? And they said, no, because parents don't bother you here. Yeah? When I was in that other borough in Kensington and Chelsea, parents would come to me every other day with queries, and that is a healthy relationship. If parents are proactively and constructively engaged with the schools continuously, that means that the quality of education generally will be much higher in those schools. The complacency that sometimes you see in some schools will not exist. And parents would have a much better relationship with the school and vice versa. So I think really what we've got to do is, through this process, we need to change the dynamic between schools and parents. Parents are not people who the schools are doing a favor. We are stakeholders in the school, and we have the absolute right to approach schools with our feedback, both positive and negative, and schools need to respond to those feedback.
Okay, good. So what have you seen or heard parents kind of attempt this and kind of fail and not get where they wanted? What do they do if they're not getting anywhere, or if they're not, they feel that they're not being heard by the local school?
So firstly, some of the reasons for not being heard, sometimes it is the way the parents approach it, and other times it's the entrenched positions of the leadership team of a school, who are hell-bent on teaching a subject in a particular way, even though they have flexibility to teach it in a different way. When parents feel as though schools are not listening to them, they will start to work with other parents. They'll get petitions going. They'll start. Sometimes they'll start getting the media involved in their campaigns. Other times they'll speak to the local MP, local councillors. They'll try and put some pressure upon the school to be more constructive in the way that they involve parents. But I think, parents in these situations, you're playing the long game. You need to be very clear about. Thank you. It's my daughter. Sorry. We have to be very clear about what we want to achieve. What do you want from this process? Do you want to take out some of the more explicit materials in the resources? Do we want to delay some of the conversations to much later years? If we're clearer to schools about what we actually want, then we can maybe start a process of coming to a conclusion about what the school is willing to give and what it's not willing to give as part of that process. I think sometimes when parents go to schools, they will say, and I think that a lot of the issues, and I would say to people here, is you really think twice before you share a WhatsApp video. Yeah. Because some of these WhatsApp videos,
apart from some truancy ones.
So some of these videos are talking about realities in different countries. So there'll be American video. There's an American video going around where people are saying this is what they're teaching in schools. Now, once there was this. I remember there was a book going around. My Chacha is gay, isn't it? And that was from Canada. So one sister texted me on WhatsApp and said, "I'm really concerned about this book." So I said, "Are they using this book in your children's school?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, why do you ask the school if they are? Because you should really only be concerned about them teaching your children a book which is actually in the school. If it's on the internet, that's a different matter. But if it's not in your children's school, then why are you getting upset about that?
It's not in your sphere of influence.
But how will it influence your child if your child is not?
I'm saying no, it's not in your sphere of influence if it's in a different country.
That's right. So I think sometimes parents can sometimes we can get riled up by situations that are not within our reality, and I've received that. Some people said someone sent me this video the other day, say this might help you, and I was going to respond. I said, how will it help me? This is about America. Okay, this is good informative information, but sometimes we spread things on WhatsApp. I remember people I've got different groups on WhatsApp and people spread news articles. And I'm always saying to people, when you send a news article, accompany that news article with something. Are you trying to make parents aware and warn them about a particular issue? Are you saying that parents should boycott a particular brand because they are taking a particular ideological position? What are you asking parents to do with that? Or are you just creating that fear that parents have that eventually leads to those parents who say, what's the point? There's no point in doing anything. The society around us is going to corrupt my child. What's the point? I've got no control. I'm a hostage to the situation that I find myself in. And I think that is
that's hugely disempowering.
And it just leads to that inactivity that we're trying to undo.
I was looking at the actual learning objectives of the learning outcomes of the actual relationships education that is statutory for primary schools, and most of it is something we would have no issue with. In fact, maybe all of it, the actual spirit of the actual, what is actually statutory, what is actually, a legal obligation, is pretty much, benign things that we don't have an issue with. So I think parents should read it. We'll put a link under the description. It was published, it should be published in Soundcloud as well by the time this goes out, inshallah. Have a look at what the actual learning outcomes are for relationships and health education, and then say to your head teacher, look, this is really good. I hope we can get some, we can be involved in choosing the right resources to achieve these learning outcomes. And by the way, I'm concerned that it won't be, used to do something outside of this remit, such as, explicit things, such as, maybe LGBT lifestyles, etc., being pushed as, or trying to kind of normalize it on children and so forth, such as gender ideology and from a particular cultural background being imposed on other cultural backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be much more effective for, if I'm a head teacher and I'm hearing some constructive stuff saying, look, we like this stuff, let's do more of that, let's help get good resource that we can achieve these objectives with, and let's be careful of this, as a kind of caveat, rather than here's a petition saying, I'm gonna, we're gonna boycott your school for this reason or that reason. So it comes down to us as parents to take a keen interest in our children's schools. And so what we've been talking about is primary schools, right? Secondary schools, I'm assuming, is a whole different kettle of fish, because sex education is statutory to some degree in as i.e. a legal obligation to some degree in secondary schools. So what is your guidance to parents about that?
So there's a few issues with regards to RSE in secondary schools. So one is that, yes, it's a statutory subject, both relationship education and sex education. RSE or RSHE is statutory in both in secondary school, all secondary schools. So I think there's a few issues here. One is that you've got the right to request withdrawal from the sex education element of RSHE, but not the relationship education element. So there's different elements of the curriculum, and so you've got the right to withdraw from what is considered to be, or what is defined by the school as the sex education element, but not the relationship education element. You can make a request to the head teacher, who has the ultimate right to decide whether to approve or reject your request to withdraw. But also another issue is that as part of the consultation process, the resources and when these curriculum outcomes are taught are not defined, just as in primary schools. So if, for example, as part of RSHE, it says, for example, there's one element which says intimate and sexual relationships, including sexual health, and there are about 10 bullet points for learning outcomes, including understanding the full range of contraceptive choices, understanding about STIs, understanding about how to get further information, including where to access confidential sexual and reproductive health advice and treatment. Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue, if parents argue in a school that this element should not be taught in year 7, which is the first year of secondary school. It should be taught later on, maybe in year 9 or year 10 or year 11. It shouldn't be taught at the beginning stages of secondary school, because it's not appropriate for it to be taught at that stage. So you can make a case for it to be delayed until the later years, and then also you can, when the consultation happens, you can input on the choice of resources and how this subject is going to be taught, so that you can maybe make some get school to make some changes in relation to how they propose that this subject is going to be taught.
Let me play a bit of devil's advocate here, right? Because a lot of people involved in education and in schooling and in counselling and stuff, they mention that unfortunately Muslim students aren't completely safe from this, that children are getting younger and younger before their first sexual encounters, and it might be one of those sensationalist kind of headlines, but I have heard some people say involved in education, that it's involved in kind of Islamic mediation services. So when Muslims bring their children when they have issues to try and resolve and get some Islamic advice, they are saying that there is a dangerously widespread and increasing problem of sisters in particular being taken advantage of by boys, or boys and girls, at school at a younger and younger age, experimenting sexually with one another, or getting involved in haram relationships. So isn't it in the child's best interest to introduce them to these things as early on as possible in year 7?
So I think in terms of it is absolutely the case that that our community is not immune from early sexual activity, from sexual relations outside of marriage. But the thing is, there's recent findings. I think sometimes people base these things on anecdotal evidence, but there's no evidence to suggest that the age of sexual intercourse amongst young people is getting much younger. So you may hear the horror stories of someone 11 or 12 getting pregnant, but these are really exceptional circumstances. These are not. It said about a third of young people have sexual relations before turning 16, and most have had sexual relations by the time they were 18, and half had done it by the time they were 17. So so sometimes these horror stories or these anecdotal pieces of information are not an accurate reflection of what the situation actually is. But that doesn't mean that it's not a situation that we need to also deal with.
Yeah.
So I think one of the issues is that whenever I speak about this subject, I don't just speak about the rights, parents' rights in schools are this, this, and this, but actually I say also, and it's really important to emphasize this, what are our responsibilities towards our children? Why is it that who are our children going to talk about these issues if they're not going to their parents? Where they're finding out information about these issues? If we don't provide opportunities or avenues within our communities, whether it be through parents or other safe spaces where young people can have their questions dealt with, then we're storing up a whole host of problems whereby our children will go to other places to find out this information. And sometimes the case is that our children are leading double lives. They're living one life at home and one life outside of the home. And so what we've got to do is really, as parents, start to deal with this. And whenever I go to different places to speak to parents, lots of parents will say, what can you do to do this? And actually, it's like that Kennedy quote, isn't it? It's not what you can do, what America can do for you. It's what you can do for your country. It's not what other people can do for your children. It's what you can do for your children. Because the primary responsibility for raising our children rests with us as parents, and we've got to start changing that outlook. For too long, we've almost subcontracted that responsibility out to the imam of the masjid, the madrasa teacher, the school teacher, and others within our community. And we've got to start taking responsibility for ourselves. Now, of course, there needs to be people who support parents in raising their children, but the primary responsibility and accountability rests with us as parents.
Yeah.
So I think definitely we need to find ways in which we deal with this, but it has to be on our own terms. So we can't just say that children are not finding out this information, so let's give them information from a foreign values perspective. Rather, let's deal with this issue ourselves. Let's try and find ways in which we can convince parents that it's in the best interest of themselves and their children that these conversations are had in the home, and it's no longer a taboo that these discussions are had in the home.
And you're helping with all these resources via SRE Islamic, I presume.
Yeah, we look at actually, because I'm looking at producing, and I've started to do some research. I've got lots of books from different perspectives on how to discuss these issues with children, and really, I think what I'm trying to create is a resource that not only just deals with the branch topics around issues of how do we deal with issues around same-sex relationships or perspectives around same-sex relationships or about boyfriend and girlfriend, but also starting from the fundamental perspective of saying to young children, because what is getting them firm upon an understanding of who they are as Muslims. The fact that the issue of why, whenever I go on Twitter and this Muslim Twitter and lots of young people on there, a lot of the discussions around from the perspective of young people are around issues as, okay, almost they've taken the liberal perspective, the secular liberal frameworks and concepts, and they've applied them to their own outlooks. So when they view an issue, they'll view it not from, did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow this or not, or did the Prophet say something about this, or they use the criteria of the societal criterion of, is this should be the freedom of that person to do what they like. Why shouldn't that person do what they like? And I think really there's a lot of young people who've not grown up with the Islamic concepts and the Islamic tarbiyah of basic concepts like, why should Allah define what is right and wrong? Concepts such as, why is the Messenger of Allah's example the best example to follow? Why should even concepts that, for example, things like things that are dealt with by Ustad Hamza Zotzes in his book Divine Reality. These very fundamental building block ideas, which I believe that young Muslims are not coming across, and in the absence of almost a disruption in perspectives. So if a young person is growing up with a very a perspective that's just been shaped by the society around them.
Yeah.
And nobody else has ever said, no, have you thought about it in another way? And from the perspective of what we believe in as Muslims. If they've never been given that perspective, then I don't blame that person, that young person, that young Muslim, from carrying that argument in the first place. Rather, it's us, our response. We failed in giving them a clearer outlook on how they should perceive the world around them and the behaviors and attitudes and concepts around them. I think we need to do much more in developing that. So this I want to build some resources that cover almost a much more
holistic.
Deal with this perspective from the branch to from the root to the branch, rather than just starting from how do we see relationships. Although that should be discussed, but there needs to be something more, as I said, more holistic than that.
Mm-hmm. What's the what are the weirdest things that you kind of questions or issues that you get from parents? You know, we've spoken in the past, and you're saying, you know, the parents call me up and say this and that, and you know, what's the kind of the weirdest or the most shocking kind of questions that you do get, and just so you can share your answers to those things.
I had a situation last year. I went to a masjid. Obviously I won't say where, and there was quite a lot of parents, and there was a parent in the front row, and he asked a question at the end, or it was a question, it was half question, half statement of fact, from his perspective, or statement of opinion. He said, look, I'm not really care about this boyfriend and girlfriend, or if my children have boyfriends and girlfriends. I really do care if they have, if my son wants to go out with another boy, or my girl wants to go out with another girl. So I said, it's almost as if I don't care. I don't care about the normal relationships, even if they're outside of marriage. But all I care about is this one issue. And I was quite shocked. I was taken aback by that, actually, because this was like
I think that's quite a widespread feeling, you know, that because of all of this sensationalism about pushing LGBT ideology and social constructs and stuff, people are like, you know, at least there's a girl he's going out with.
Yeah, that is.
So the bar has kind of really been low.
That's a real problem in itself, because that's because that we're saying that we're trying to say that some aspects of zina are okay, and others are not. Some manifestations are okay. But also, I remember once a mother called me, and she's quite distraught. She'd been divorced from her husband for a few years, and the father had been taking the children out. And one day, I think it was about the children were 6 and 8. He said, well, the children came back, and the father had basically talked to them about everything about sexual relationships at that young age, and told them about the intricacies of everything. And she was really devastated by that, because she didn't really want her children to be exposed to that, and there was no reason to expose them to that at such a young age. There was no external issue that had arisen that meant that discussion had to be had at that stage for children as young as that. And obviously that was a really difficult situation. I had a father who spoke to me from across the world, actually. Somebody here gave me details about somebody, and he contacted me and said, look, during lockdown, my son said to me and my wife that I'm gay. And that's my identity, and so they're trying to deal with that, and so we're trying to support them to try and deal with that issue.
I mean, one of the things that continually comes up from people, sometimes well-meaning people, they don't realize the kind of inherent racism or white supremacy in their own opinions and about this, but they'll kind of arrogantly claim, oh, you Muslims, you know, your children, they might, you know, come out as gay one day. What are you going to do then, right? And there's so many implicit kind of premises that are specific to white Western kind of history and culture that are just taken as universal facts in that question. How do you go about answering those types of challenges? So here you have an example of somebody who's accepted this label, which never existed, you know, outside of Victorian England, you know, until a few 200 years ago, 150 years ago.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting issue, because how I think how an identity around people's sexual preferences has become an identity, a badge that they wear, and also something that has become almost something that's fixed within a person.
Mm.
And I think there's no behavior out there which people say cannot be changed. Yeah, even the most ingrained behavioral positions. People will say you can change anything. If you've got the determination to change it, you can change it.
Yeah.
So, for example, I remember speaking to a psychiatrist once, and he said he'd been struck off because he was speaking to patients, people coming to him who had same-sex attractions, and they wanted to they didn't want to act upon those. So he had sessions where they would had talking therapy to try and talk through how they could resist those temptations, because that's what the patient wanted. And he got struck off because that's not allowed. It's not allowed because that's almost like seeing this tendency or same-sex attraction as being something negative that needs to be changed, even though the patient wanted to change that. I know a lot of people within the Muslim community who say, look, I've got same-sex attraction, but I'll never act upon it. I remember I spoke to an imam once, and he said, look, I had a HIFS program, and there was a young Muslim boy who came up to me. He's half of the Quran. He was leading Salah, and he said to me, look, he confided in me and said, look, from the young age, for the last few years, actually, I've had these attractions for other males. Yeah, and I know this is forbidden, and I'll never act upon it. Yeah, but I just want to let you know this is what I'm feeling. And he said, look, what I did with this boy was I made him lead the Salah from then on. Yeah, to say to him, look, your position, it's like any other desire. If you have a desire that you want to fulfill that contravenes the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you actively resist that, that should be something that we applaud, something that we should be happy about, not something negative. Unfortunately, sometimes in our community, when someone says, look, I feel this, I have this feeling, yeah, and we almost by our reaction entrench that as an identity.
Yeah.
So we will say, how dare you become Qawmilut? How dare you become a Khusra? We use all those words about people who have same-sex attractions. And then we lead them into a situation where there's a potential to help them. And I know I remember there was a discussion group where there was hundreds of people who had same-sex attractions, and they were helping each other to try and overcome those Muslims.
Yeah, I read something on Muslim Matters many years ago, written by someone from a website called Straight Struggle or something.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I mean, it happens. The thing is, that's where culture comes in, right? So according to two different cultures, if the same person, same boy or a child, for example, he let's say Yusuf and Roger or whatever, right? They're in two different cultures, two different surroundings, and the same thing happens. The same initial either wiswas from shaitan or a firing neuron here and there, and they begin to feel curious about same sex, attracted to, or looking at someone on the same sex and then attracted, impressed with or attracted to someone on the same sex. So in one culture, let's say Roger, in the white Western kind of liberal paradigm, he's going to be jumped on and said, this is your label, this is who you are. All of the epistemology of closet and coming out and that kind of, this is part of your identity, and it's going to reinforce things, right? Those even from a neurochemical kind of pathway, what was chemical, a neurotransmitter being dissipated in the and dissolved across a few synapses. When it's repeated enough, it becomes architectural. It becomes, especially when the child is young, brain plasticity, that becomes, he or she is able to alter the brain's kind of neural kind of architecture that way. So that, and that person, it's like walking along a path, some grass. If you walk along it enough times, it turns into a path, right? It becomes permanent. So what was characterized yesterday as transient, as subject to diffusion and dissipation, is now characterized by something solid and permanent, right? If you look at Yusuf, on the other hand, he might have had the same initial stimulus, the same initial input, right? But because of the culture, because of the discourse around him, he just shrugged it off as, maybe he might have said, a waswas from shaitan. And pretty much that's it. He might, if he dwells on it, if he's labeled a bit more, then he'll have a bit more of a struggle kind of recognizing and relating to that, trying to reconcile that with his deen. If he's unable to recognize the cultural kind of constructs that are being imposed from outside, if he lives in, for example, a Western society or a westernized society, he might not see it straight away. He might think these are just facts. This is who I am, rather than just some. I am actually Yusuf, but this is just something that happened to me. So this is why the culture around a person has such a huge impact on this, and it can actually lead to, like I just said, a rewiring of the brain, right? If you're especially at a young age, because of the plasticity of the brain. That's why the kind of the old saying that London cabbies have a enlarged kind of that portion of the brain that deals with spatial awareness and stuff, and because they have to memorize all of the streets in London. So likewise, if somebody is reinforced with, this is your identity, this is who you are, this is something real outside of the mind, when it's not, it's just something which is a social construct imposed by society. And now society is, many people and thinkers are recognizing this, that it's just social constructs. It begins to make something permanent and leave an imprint on a child. I guess that is partly what we need to get across to young people as well. I mean, I always mention that whenever, sometimes when I'm speaking to youth at a program or something, you can tell from the way they ask their questions that many of them have just absorbed cultural kind of values and constructs that aren't real. They don't exist outside of the white imagination, but they've absorbed them as though they're universal truths, right? And this is part of hegemony. This is part of the new kind of coloniality, really. And it needs to be, in my opinion, there needs to be a process of decolonization of thinking, of our language, even sometimes. If just using these terms as though they're discrete categories, gay, straight, lesbian, homosexual, heterosexual, pansexual, whatever that is, right? As though they're, because, even if somebody accepts and absorbs these labels and begins to champion these labels, it's not something that science, it's not something that in empirical reality cares about much, because it's something that cultures have come up with, people have come up with to agree on, let's call this thing XYZ. It's like money, right? Money, it's like somebody trying to investigate the empirical reality of so-called sexuality, heterosexuality or homosexuality. It's like somebody trying to analyze, what is this? Look at the atomic structure of this 50p coin. What makes it worth 50p? It's absurd, right? It's just a cultural effect that people have gotten together and said, let's call this half a pound. 50 pence. One of the things I remember hearing, along this vein, that there's no such thing as homosexuality or heterosexuality, these types of things outside the mind, because even if somebody is claims that they are homosexual, that is their full kind of their identity and so forth, there are 100 million sperm cells within that man right now, fiendishly looking for an egg to fertilize, right? So we have to sometimes separate the empirical, what is the actual observable and testable facts, from the values and the kind of moral and cultural kind of conversations. And I think the problems occur when, and this is the feeling I got from the Birmingham parents when I spoke to them, and that is when moral and kind of values-based and social kind of issues and constructs were being imposed on children as though they were facts, as though as this is science, right? When science doesn't care what what social constructs or what kind of morality you choose to live your life by, because science is just talking about what is there, what is reproducible, what is testable in an empirical sense.
And I think also the very good points. Also attached to that is this idea from the secular liberal perspective that nothing should stop you from fulfilling your desires. Why should it be that why should religion stop you from fulfilling your essential desires? Because that's just going to make you unhappy, and happiness is about fulfilling your desires. So basically, so it's like almost as if they consider to be they first of all, they look upon religion from their Westocentric view of religion, that it oppressed the masses. But secondly, they believe that no one should decide on what you want, how you want to live your life, and nobody should interfere with that, apart from maybe the law. But even in the social aspects, there is very little law now around sexual proclivity, sexual interaction. Obviously, there's still some issues around sexual relations with animals and children, which are prohibited. But besides that, there are very few rules surrounding that. And so this is ultimately what's going to happen in a society where people say that that religion should no longer guide how you live your lives. And after you've done away with God in the public domain, then it's up to the human mind to decide on what is and isn't for you acceptable and unacceptable. And I think
if they actually
sorry,
go ahead.
Even there's a discussion happening at the moment around should you consider pedophilic tendencies to be a criminal, or should you see it as a preference that someone has that is not inherently wrong. So there's a starting discussion. There was a TED talk out there where somebody was saying, I work with people who have pedophilic tendencies, and she spoke about them as though they were victims, and there was such an outcry at that stage that they had to pull it down. But as I said, as time goes by and as these ideas gain more currency, there'll be a time where people will say, yeah, there's a way of, they'll say, okay, maybe if someone has a sexual relationship with a 9-year-old or 8-year-old or 7-year-old, that's bad. But what about that 15-year-old or someone on the cusp of 16? And then slowly by slowly, they'll change the goalposts and say, actually, there's nothing wrong with that either. And they'll get some pseudoscience to back up their claims. But the reality is, once you say there's no boundaries, no fixed boundaries for what is good and bad, anything can potentially be good and bad.
If they actually were straight up about it, pardon the pun, if they were kind of forthright and saying, look, these are our beliefs and values and cultural norms and so forth, that I can live with, because then we can just say, fair enough, lakum dinukum waliya din. To you is your way, you're welcome to follow your way. To me is my way, and let's not impose our values, our kind of metaphysical positions and our beliefs and so forth on each other. And the problem comes is when one, as what is happening in some areas now, one group or one kind of social or ideological position is, with utilizing every lever of state power, unfortunately as well, imposing those beliefs, those moral positions on others. And what's even more insulting is and arrogant is imposing them as though they were universal truths and facts and science and empirical reality, when they're sadly unable to differentiate between the two. So I think one kind of angle that should be pursued and pressed upon is to let the for want of a better word, the white liberal, the kind of the European, the peak of evolution, right? The European male, white man, let him or her help them recognize that your beliefs are not, universal truths about the universe. They're not, they happen to be cultural effects. They happen to be, results of your history, results of your cultural background and your various philosophers and political movements and so on and so forth. Their beliefs. It's not like you can claim that you discovered it in a lab somewhere, because science doesn't care about your beliefs. Science doesn't say there is, or talk about sexuality as though it's some kind of somatic fact about the body. Sexuality is something just people have labeled based on these kind of a wide array of practices based on a previous history, right? Many people have written about this. So getting the other side, so to speak, to actually recognize the fact that their positions that they regard as, universal and applicable to all peoples and to be imposed on others, getting them to recognize that these are actually my cultural positions that I inherited from my forefathers, that would be a win, I think, or a good kind of aim to get people to wake up to that, and that then we can have some maturity in how to actually coexist and live with other people.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of there's a strange thing that in schools they're arguing that, and I think one of the arguments from Birmingham was that the issue is that in order to treat other people with respect at a younger age, their different lifestyles need to be much more normalized so that you treat people well. But that's really that's a disingenuous argument, because none of us ever went through these classes at school, but when we went in our workplaces, we found people who have different views and opinions that we completely disagree with. People who are atheists, people who are drinkers, people who are in same-sex relationships, and we managed to work with them, and there was no major problems. How was that? How did that happen? Did it happen because we went to classes, or because we knew we could divorce disagreeing with somebody's lifestyle choice or their perspective about life from the day-to-day treating somebody who's treating someone as a human being? And so I think it's I
mean, the Birmingham the parents, they're a testament to this. They Andrew Moffat, who was the author of those books that caused the controversy, he was working there for years, and they had no issue with him. He was he identifies as gay, and they didn't say get rid of his teacher. It was only when they perceived that he stepped over a boundary and began to impose his ideological and moralistic kind of perspectives on children, that's when they started to cause a fuss, and when they perceived that they weren't being respected and kind of and spoken down to, so to speak. So that's a very important point. And every Muslim growing up has this understanding that there are Muslims and there are other people who aren't Muslims, and this is what we do, this is what they do. They might eat the bacon sandwich in the school canteen, but you don't do that. They might do this, you don't do that. They might have boyfriend girlfriend relationship, you're not supposed to do that. And there's no kind of injustice or anything perpetuated from that perspective. But I think it's a realization that there's no ontological reality to these positions that are being spread as facts, like certain things about ideological positions about sexuality or gender in some cases. Because some people recognize that there's no ontological reality, there's no empirical fact to that, that's when they become a bit more offended and a bit more kind of proactive and aggressive in kind of attacking anyone who compares this to the guy eating a bacon sandwich, having a girlfriend, or drinking some alcohol or something. So because they try to kind of or sensitive to this to someone exposing that underlying reality. So that's an issue that we've dealt with before in the past, of people being reluctant to accept that their beliefs are their beliefs and they're not to be imposed on others. And the irony in all of this is that it's the Muslims who are actually calling for more tolerance, genuine tolerance of difference of opinion and different beliefs to be kind of given their space.
Yeah, and actually, the interesting thing is that sometimes you'll find these liberals will argue that we want to find a middle ground. But actually, when I've ever discussed with liberals, I find that they're very fixed in their position. I was once on a radio discussion about this subject with somebody who's a humanist. And I said, look, we need to find a middle ground. And he said, why do we need to find a middle ground? And I thought,
there's only haqq and batil.
I said, look, we can agree to disagree on lots of issues, but we've got to find a way of averting conflict in schools. That's a real reality that is not a part of your theoretical perspective on these issues. We need to say that if we take this stand and we say, okay, there are people in the society who identify as gay, and that we can agree to treat them well. We don't have to accept everybody's lifestyle decisions in order to treat people well. And for him, that was like, no, tolerance is not enough. It's not enough to be tolerant. So I said, from that perspective, then, if we carry his argument forward, then we're never going to find a source of dealing with these conflicts, and these conflicts will perpetuate on a number of different fronts. And I found that really illuminating. It shouldn't have been surprising, because sometimes liberals who cast themselves as being people who are tolerant are only tolerant of certain perspectives. So it's really interesting. If the government or if people who are interested in averting conflict wants to resolve this, then they've got to ensure that they're not creating fuel for this conflict to exist. And I don't want to use these terms, culture wars, as people are using now on the streets, but it does create amongst people of faith across different faith groups. It creates a real issue of that you've got these 9 predicted characteristics. But whenever they talk about diversity and inclusion, those 9 characteristics are always boiled down to 1 or 2. And so they never talk about faith and the importance of people of faith and their perspectives. It's always about people from certain backgrounds, which is a problem.
Okay, I'm really conscious of the time, so let's quickly summarize for the parents watching, right? So let me know if I got the right end of the stick with this one. When it comes to primary schools, there's no legal kind of requirement to teach sex education. That's point 1. There is a legal requirement to teach sex education in secondary schools, but it's open to the school to do whenever they feel it's suitable for the kids, and it should be done in consultation with parents to take into account their children's specific needs and their own values kind of background. When it comes to primary schools, what there is a legal obligation to teach is relationships and health education. The majority of the learning outcomes that the government is demanding be achieved through them, realized through that curriculum, is something most Muslims would not have an issue with. However, the primary schools do need to consult parents, and parents, Muslim parents in particular, you guys out there listening now, you have to be proactive in your relationship with your school's headmaster, headmistress, head teacher. Give them positive commendation when they do something good. Express your concerns when they do something you don't like. Don't just go into full-blown campaign mode. They're not your MP, they're your school head teacher. And get involved in coming to some kind of agreement and in what resources that you're going to use, what resources that you're not going to use, what things that you're concerned that you don't want to expose your children to. And if they are doing any sex education in primary school, you are still 100% within your right to withdraw them from their lessons. And finally, withdrawing them from sex education and in these types of lessons doesn't mean you just ignore that issue. You have the obligation as parents, first and foremost, to give your children the proper education with regards to those things within an Islamic paradigm that understands the broader truths around why they are here, who Allah is, where they get their morality from, and so on and so forth. Do you think that's a good summary? What would you give me an A for that?
There's one additional issue that I think is useful that I think just talk about very, very briefly is that we need to also ensure that although we start those conversations off face to face or person to person rather than through template letters, but what's really important is that, especially if it looks like the school is not really responding to your legitimate concerns, really try and at least have some of, if those conversations are had over the phone, then you summarize them in an email and send them to the school and say, it's just a summary of our conversation. Is this correct?
Have it in writing, basically.
Yeah, so you keep an audit trail of those conversations, because it's very important. At a later stage, it may be necessary at some stage or another, if we find that lots of schools are not fulfilling their statutory responsibility to consult with parents, that there may be a need to do a judicial review. And if that's needed, we need some level of examples of where parents have sought to consult, sought to get schools to consult them, and they've been rebuffed.
Yeah.
So just really keep that paper trail. That's really, really important. I know I'll speak to somebody from another community who's actually started a judicial review about RE and RSC, and I'm having conversations with them at the moment. It's really interesting that they're trying to say that because the right to withdraw was taken away from parents without an act of parliament, that's ultra vires, that was legal. Yeah. So they believe they've got a very good case, at least on this one small issue, to argue that the government has gone against, didn't fulfil its statutory responsibilities when they passed the regulations, which is not an act of parliament. And so,
let me guess, is a Christian or Jewish person?
Well, actually, the person's a Christian person, but he's actually, as part of the judicial review, he's got a Christian, a Catholic, a Muslim parent, all on board, as part of that judicial review, as the people that he'll use to show the impact of the government's withdrawal. But I think
the Muslim community is young. Inshallah, one day the Muslims will be at the forefront of calling for justice and fairness and calling out these ultra vires, governments that are overstepping the boundaries.
Also, and then you speak to any legal person, because they say the law is blind. The law isn't blind. If you have a case sometimes that is fought just by a Muslim parent, the prejudices of the judge will come into play and say, oh, this is just a Muslim parent kicking up a fuss.
Yeah.
If you've got a broad selection of parents from different backgrounds, they're more likely to take that seriously, unfortunately. And the last thing I'd like to mention before we go is that, it's really, really important that as parents, we can't achieve any success in any of these matters without the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the last thing is really make dua. Make dua if you want to achieve success in terms of in what you're doing in schools. Make dua, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his help and support in doing what you're doing, and especially ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for support in raising our children, making sure they remain guided, making sure they stick firmly upon this Sirat al-Mustaqim, that they're guided to remain Muslims and worshippers and people who obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything that they do. And I think that's really important. Sometimes we focus a lot on the material means, but we forget about who's actually in control of everything and why we need to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not just concentrate and focus on our own efforts.
Excellent. Jazakumullah khairan. Really appreciate it, bro. Thanks for joining. And Jazakumullah khairan to you at home for watching, tuning in. If you made it to the end of this podcast, congratulations, you're awesome. Don't forget to check out Yusuf's SRE Islamic. We'll put some links in the description, inshallah. Donate to the organization, help them make more and more excellent resources for us all. If you want to take our relationship to the next level, don't forget to subscribe. If you like this podcast, give it a like and a share. Share it with your friends. Let us know in the comments any bits in particular you agreed with, disagreed with, and we'll have a read of them later, inshallah. Just another reminder, we're available wherever you get your podcasts, so Apple, Spotify, Google, all that good stuff, Castbox as well. And so you can, of course, listen when you're driving, looking after the kids, or cooking, cleaning, whatever, all that, exercising as well. Stay fit. From me and the Islam 21 team, excuse me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Unscripted.